Thank you for tuning in to another episode of InRange. This is the... Oh, you want to actually do a video today? Yeah.
Is it filming time? It's filming time.
It's filming time. Right. No more iPhone time. So this is another update in the What Would Stoner Do project.
Yes.
It's one that's been requested heavily. And in fact, I didn't think that we were going to include this as part of the What Would Stoner Do project, but the more I thought about it, the more I realized this is actually more What Would Stoner Do than any other part of the project.
It's a very appropriate bit.
Which is to talk about the AR-15 magazine.
Right.
So I think that this was done outside of our project by a large margin. However, there have been companies that have addressed this in a way that I think Stoner would have, and we're going to get to that in a minute. But the AR-15, the feeding device of your gun, is probably more important than the gun.
Well, it is a critical component. If the feeding device isn't 100% functional, the gun never will be. Right. So you have to have good magazines.
And as good as the AR-15 is, I think its largest failure point throughout its entire history as a career as a service weapon has been the magazine.
Totally agree.
So when the AR-15 started, it started with 20-round mags.
Well, almost.
Yeah, why don't you tell us more?
Technically, it started with 25-round straight mags. Not actually that much different than FAMAS mags in shape.
This, just longer.
Right. Okay. And they ended up deciding 25 was a little too long, so they dropped it to 20, which is a shorter magazine, and entirely straight still. And then eventually they decided 20 wasn't enough, and now they didn't care if it was a little longer, so they went to 30. But,
and straight matters because the architecture of the cartridge determines how they're going to feed properly unless you need a curve in the magazine for them to actually line up and properly feed throughout the cycling process.
Exactly. 223 doesn't have much taper. It has a little bit, right at kind of that point where you can do 20 to 25 rounds in a straight mag without any problem. Once you get to 30, you kind of have to accommodate the case. Accommodate the case taper.
Otherwise, the rounds get buggered up in that cycling process. Now, they weren't exactly this in the beginning. They were waffle mags.
Yep, and they had aluminum followers too.
Aluminum, this one does.
Oh,
this one still has an aluminum follower. This is an old school 20 round.
Yeah.
So, but this, back in the time of the development of the AR-15, this was fairly new. This was space age stuff.
And it was supposed to be a disposable magazine.
Right.
And maybe a little controversial as such.
But the goal was you use it, throw it away, have another one.
Right.
Now, turns out in the battlefield, these being disposable is not so real.
Lots of things have been designed to be disposable by militaries, and then 40 years later, that very first production one is still being reused.
There are 30s still in service from the Vietnam era.
Yeah.
And I know this, at least in the Air Force, because I have some buddies that were in Air Force, or at least, in the recent conflicts. And they told me stories about they got issued stuff out of the Armory, and they got mags out there like, this is like Granddad literally used this mag, which tells you something about the service life of some of the stuff in the military is not appropriately maintained and refreshed. Yeah. And that's one of the problems with the magazine.
Right.
But this was way ahead of its time, a stamped aluminum magazine with at one point an aluminum follower. And the idea behind this was to reduce weight and be disposable. But even when it wasn't disposable, was to reduce weight on the combat load.
Right. Yep.
Everything before this was sheet metal.
Well, sheet steel.
Fair enough. Yeah. Stamp sheet steel. So anyway, so that's what we're dealing with here. And so this was really the first one that got real service, 20-rounders. And then, as you said, turned out capacity wasn't quite what it needed to be.
Those 25s, while he's looking through there, the 25s never made it beyond the very first prototype guns. So.
And we went to the 30.
Yep.
And a number of manufacturers made these. This is a standard USGI aluminum magazine. Gives you extra 10 rounds of capacity at not very much of a weight gain. And the follower has gone through many iterations throughout the history of this magazine. They've had problems with the followers not being properly anti-tilt. They had problems with different types of ammunition. We're seeing that again now with the M855A1 and the magazine and the actual feed angle. But these followers have changed throughout time, and each and every follower that replaced the previous one fixed every problem with the magazine until it didn't fix every problem with the magazine.
Right.
Magpul has even made aftermarket ones which are anti-tilt, and I can go ahead and tell you that I've used them, and they do improve the USGI magazine. The problem with the USGI magazine, while the follower can be improved, isn't the follower.
No, it's the feed lips.
It's this part.
It's actually the aluminum.
Yeah.
Because if you use these as they were intended initially and used them once and threw them away, they'd be basically flawless.
Yeah, no, that's
really
true.
Never have any issues with
Exactly, but when they land up being in service since the Vietnam War, things happen. They get dropped, these get dented, they get smashed, the sides get smashed, these feed lips get smashed, and it turns out that when this gets out of index or out of proper spec, all of these problems occur.
Yep, it just doesn't work right anymore.
If you've ever had a double feed in your AR-15, there's a 99% chance it was your magazine.
Yeah.
I mean, it can happen outside of that, but the magazines almost always would induce such issues. Yeah. And so they made little things that were you could gauge them and try to figure out if this mags work. There's all sorts of voodoo and magic where you load the magazine, tap it from the bottom, do rounds pop out, you look at, you breathe on it, you rub a rubber chicken around it, you hold it up and wonder and pray.
You do the Nintendo thing.
Oh, right.
good.
But
Sounds
there's all this voodoo and magic you can do with these mags to determine if they're good or not.
And that all comes from the basic core problem of the thing, which is because it's an aluminum, because the sides and the feed lips are aluminum, they can get out of shape slightly enough that they will cause malfunctions, but it won't be immediately obvious to the eye that there's anything wrong.
And they may not induce malfunctions constantly.
Right.
Like they're just that close. And
Right.
and so a magazine that looks normal and works well suddenly doesn't.
Right, a little bit of wobble, tilt back and forth in the mag well, if it's in the wrong position, it'll start giving you malfunctions. But if it's not, and maybe it can also be dependent on spring pressure. So it may give you malfunctions for the first couple rounds, or maybe for the last couple in the magazine. You add all of those factors together, and it becomes voodoo to try and diagnose, is this magazine reliable, or is it not reliable? And that's where you get all of these tools and techniques of assessing magazines. But ultimately, the problem is, it's a metal feed lip.
It's an aluminum
metal.
feed lip. Let's be even more thorough. Yes.
So with the AK mags, you don't really have these issues because AK feed lips are like 1/8-inch thick steel, and you're never going to get accidentally deformed. If you get run over by a tank, you'll know it.
Yeah.
But with these things, it's always kind of a guessing game. Is that magazine reliable? Well, the only way I'll find out is by putting 90 rounds through it, and if all 90 go, then yeah, it's probably good. But I can't afford to do that for every magazine I have. Every time it might have gotten damaged.
And a magazine that was good right now that you just dropped on the range or on a training event or at the match or even in combat and then pick it back up and put it back in your kit may have just got the damage that caused it to no longer be reliable.
Maybe. Or maybe it's still fine.
Yep. And so this really is the insidious and most dangerous part of the AR-15 system was this magazine, and it might have been a bridge too far with making a completely aluminum magazine with aluminum feed lips.
Maybe.
I'm willing to say that there were some issues here.
Okay.
So I understand it, but you said like the AK avoids the problem by having that big solid steel part, but then again, they weren't worried about weight loss.
True.
Russians don't seem to care about stuff being heavy, and we do, and it makes sense. If you can carry an extra magazine with an extra 30 rounds, that matters.
Yeah.
And there's a reason for this. So that's what happened with the USGI mag. And all the voodoo around it is dubious and questionable. But then what happens? We start seeing people thinking new modern materials start coming around. Mm-hmm. Maybe we can make something better than this out of a more modern material.
Right.
And you see, this is an Orlite.
That's an Orlite.
Israeli Orlite.
Yep.
And another equivalent of that, these are very early polymer attempts at magazines. This is a thermold.
So the Canadians did those. Mm-hmm. The Israelis did these. Good idea. I don't know that the material science was quite there for these things yet. These are still kind of fragile mags.
This was ahead of its time. And the reason I tried to use thermals way back when. We're talking pre-Magpul. Yeah.
Oh, yeah. Well,
we've been
long
shooting for a long
Magpul.
time, right? Yeah. And these melt. You put these in a hot gun, these will actually melt. So the polymer...
Hence the classic nickname, the Thermelt.
The Thermelt. And so the Thermold magazines, while they were ahead of their time and trying to do something unique and different, and by the way, what's interesting is this polymer mag and the Orlite are both lighter, slightly, than the USGI aluminums. So my thought, and I'm reading the tea leaves here, is that when they made these original polymer mags, they weren't thinking they were making something more rigid. They thought they were making something slightly lighter. That's my guess.
Yeah.
But these are slightly lighter, and so they went to a more modern material. But it turned out, I haven't had a lot of experience with Orlites. I don't know.
They get a lot of flack on the net. I only have one or two of them. I've used them a little bit. That one in particular is just beat up.
Yeah.
Not the fault of the magazine. The design, that one just happens to have been really put through the ringer.
I can straight up tell you thermolds are bad news.
Yeah.
Avoid thermolds at all costs. They were just ahead of their time, and the polymer that was used was inappropriate. In fact, I've seen them fracture and shatter.
Yeah.
They're just not good.
Interestingly, not just ARs. They're Thermold G3 and FAL mags as well.
Never used those.
Neither have I, but I've seen them out there.
And then in Gamerland, we saw stuff happen like guys would make this. This is steel.
Yeah, that's got to be good.
It's got an interesting braided spring in it. This is from CMMG. This is old gamer mag. It's got a freaking metal follower.
Yeah.
Right? Okay. When we think, okay, steel. It's got the good feed lips. This is going to be a good magazine. These things are pieces of garbage. I've never seen one of these work. The idea was to increase capacity, not for combat loadout, but mostly for gamers and competition shooters. Mm-hmm. These might work. I've never seen one of these work. These things are straight up crap. Okay. And then we saw other stuff start happening. So what happens now? Magpul comes along, and they really changed the game.
Yeah.
This is a Gen 3 now. There are Gen 1s, Gen 2s, Gen 3s. They're all pretty close.
They're all fine. They tweak a few things. They're kind of like Glocks.
Yep.
A Gen 1 Glock is still a great gun.
This is when the polymer and the material science came together with a design that actually improved the magazine, not just in terms of what it's made out of, but actually in its reliability.
Yes.
And what happens here is these are no longer insidious. When a Magpul mag is broken, like a feed lip, literally cracks and falls off. We're not saying these don't break. But if something
they cost like $10, $8. They're gonna break.
Cheap to make. Well, I haven't seen a lot of them break.
Over time, they're going to break. They're not like AK mags.
No.
Which basically are indestructible until the end of time.
But unlike this, which could be insidiously looking okay and not work, this, when it's broken, it's obviously broken.
Yep.
The feed lip is cracked and fallen off, or the seam here is split, and you can actually see it bulging. I have seen some that were partially broken and bulging here, and people duct taped them back together, and they actually continued to work.
Okay.
But when this most all important part are the feed lips are deformed, out of spec, or cracked or broken, it is obvious on a Magpul magazine when that has occurred.
With a polymer like that, you don't really get what's called plastic deformation, which is where if you start to take metal and bend it, there is a period of elastic deformation where when you put force on, it'll bend, and when you remove the force, it will come back to its original shape. When you add too much force, you hit the plastic deformation limit, and it will stay in that new shape when you remove the force. The problem with aluminum and steel is you get that plastic deformation. If you put enough force on it, it'll bend and stay bent. These polymers generally, I mean, for our purposes, don't. They will, if you put force, they will bend, and they will either snap off or return to their original form.
That said, whatever the polymer magic is inside Magpul products, it is the rigidity is sufficient that I have never seen that to be a problem.
Yeah.
And when they first came out with them, they had these little clip-on like covers that you clip on, and the idea behind that was you would reduce the amount of pressure being induced upon the feed lips while they were in long-term storage, and people were really worried about putting on those little covers. Turned out you didn't need them. Yeah. You could fully load these Magpul mags and leave them loaded for, and we know this now, for a long time, 8 years, and pull them out and they're fine. Well, we saw the Thermold and the Orlite reduce weight over the USGI aluminum. Magpul mags are actually heavier.
Just slightly.
They went a little heavier. And so while this is a more modern material, it did add a little weight, but this is an instance in which adding a little weight actually turned out to be the right decision because they made a more reliable magazine that can be visually identified to be within spec.
Right.
And we're talking the weight difference is like ounces.
Fraction of an ounce between a GI mag and that. It's like 0.7 ounces.
The weight cost was worth the reliability improvement that comes.
Absolutely.
Magpul mags are, in my opinion, the stellar example of reliable AR-15 magazines.
Yeah.
You take your AR-15, and we're not sponsored by Magpul, but this is just years of experience using them. Every other mag on the market, there might be others that are just as fine. I don't know, but I do know that if I put a Magpul mag in my AR and I looked at it and I know there's nothing wrong with it, it's going to work.
Yeah.
It just is. It's just going to work.
It's going to work, and they're cheap. You know, I don't need to go spend $30. I think you have a Lancer in there.
We have a bunch. We'll get into that in a minute.
I don't need to go spend $30 on a Lancer. I can spend $8 or $10 on a PMag, and it just works. So when people ask, what mags do we use in the what would Stoner do rifles? PMags.
Magpul. PMags, straight up. And there might be others on the market that can match the performance. The problem is they're not going to supersede the performance.
And they're not going to match the price.
And I already have years of Magpul experience trusting the product.
Yep.
There's absolutely no reason to change.
Right.
I trust it already.
Yeah.
Here is a Lancer, or essentially. Lancer tried to do something which was essentially inverse to what we're saying is the positive attributes of a PMag, in that they put a steel feed lip on a polymer mag.
Right.
So, well, now they did use steel instead of aluminum.
That's good.
Which is better than aluminum. The reality is this is still a pliable and bendable metal that you cannot visually identify if it has a problem like you could polymer that's fractured or broken.
So it's going to be better than GI because it takes more force to make a steel feed lip magazine malfunction. But the fundamental problem that you can't visually identify if it's bent or not, unless it's really bent. But the really insidious ones are the little tiny bends that are just enough to induce the occasional malfunction that you can never you can never remember which magazine it was and where it was in the mag long enough to be able to rectify it.
Now, with that said, I have had actually very positive results with Lancer mags in terms of reliability. I've never had a problem with Lancer mag, but the question I would pose is, the reason we add these steel feed lip inserts is to assuage the concern that these polymer feed lips are not sufficiently strong enough.
True.
But if you believe, and I do, that these polymer feed lips are sufficiently strong enough, then this mitigation is mitigating nothing that's actually a real problem anyway.
Right.
So the question then comes to me is why?
Why? Yeah.
So there's that. Now PMag also, or Magpul also did make 20s if you wanted something that's a similar size profile of the original USGI. They're very close, but you know, whatever.
You know, to me, the same question comes up with Magpul now makes AK mags as well.
They do. I do not have a lot of success with those so far.
I've never had one give me problems, but just like why would I buy a Lancer AR mag? That's why would I buy a Magpul AK mag?
You're not dealing with the reliability issue.
What are you? You're reducing weight a little bit.
Yeah.
But like the Russians, when it comes to an AK, I'm not that concerned about it.
That said, there are polymer AK mags, usually the Circle 10s from Bulgaria, the Arsenal mags, typically here in the United States. They have been 100% as reliable as Magpul mags. And I would say, and this is not trying to diss Magpul, because we're saying that the Magpul AR-15 products are phenomenal. I would say that if I was going to go with, and I have gone with polymer mags for my AK, I will go with the Bulgarians. Okay. The Circle 10 mags, they work reliably. I have been...
The Russian, they're called Bakelite. Those things are great, too.
I've seen some weird results with the AK mags from Magpul. We're talking about AR-15s here. Then other people came to the market, and there's a million of these polymer mags. Here's where things go awry again. This is something from Plinker Arms. I think it was sold by Cheaper Than Dirt or one of the little kind of budget catalogs. I mean, touch that mag. That thing is, you can flex it. That is a different polymer than the Magpul. Now, it will still give you the benefit of understanding that it's broken or seeing that it's broken. Here's the difference. Whatever the polymer that's being used in the rigidity of the Magpul mags, these actually work, oddly, but they break really easily. You drop them and they just tend to shatter. So the Magpul, you can drop them right on a rock, and for the most part, pick them up and use them again. They don't break. Yeah. Those Plinker mags, super cheap, super small, but man, they do shatter. So that's a problem there. That's a material science issue.
Yeah.
One of the other issues that occur, or one of the things that tried to happen before Magpul became the answer, someone else tried to solve the problem. HK.
And Setme as well.
Yes, correct.
Setme did the same sort of thing.
I don't have one in here, but that's the one we're talking about. This is an actual HK, quote-unquote, high reliability magazine. They issued these not only to mitigate the concerns with the failing USGI mags, and there was a brief blurb where we saw the US experimenting with the HK high reliability magazines. These are steel. And
I believe those were actually originally developed for the SA-80. Because HK rebuilt all of the British SA-80s, which used standard AR mags, and the mags were a source of problems in the SA-80, like they were here, the aluminum mags.
Now, being that these are quite thick steel for what they are, the ability for you to bend these feed lips is a very difficult endeavor. You would have to kind of try.
Yeah.
I think even dropping this on a rock from a distance is probably not going to do it. This magazine is definitely built rigidly. It is strong. It is heavy. It is an overbuilt magazine. Now, everyone thought this was going to fix some of the problems, but for the polymer thing, it also uses a metallic follower.
A steel follower.
Yep. And there are, at least, this one still, there's not really any drainage out of these, and there were concerns or issues that actually occurred in the field where water got in these magazines, and you'd have to hold them upside down to get the water out because there was no drain holes. And I don't have...
Steel.
These did rust.
What could go wrong?
Now, they are anodized, and in theory that shouldn't happen, but it did happen, in which the steel follower rusted into the high reliability steel walls of the magazine, and you actually got a follower stuck due to rust and water corrosion inside of these magazines. This is more of a saltwater environment kind of problem.
Yeah.
I think the Navy saw it, but these are also still being made by HK. They are extraordinarily expensive. I only have one of them because they are so expensive, and they are still issuing them with the HK 416 project.
Okay.
We now see guys in France getting issued their 416Fs, and sure as heck, the magazines being issued with them are HK high reliability magazines, which I will go ahead and argue for sure are not as reliable as the lighter weight PMAG equivalent.
The much lighter weight. What's the weight on this thing?
We're going to get to that in a minute. So that's an interesting point.
Yeah.
Okay. We're going to get to weight in a minute because that's a whole other story. Then we saw other things happening. So
what if I want more bullets?
What if I want more, right? Well, here is Jim Sullivan, and we spoke to the man himself. In fact, this was Jim Sullivan's magazine. He gave it to us.
Yep.
With his sticker on it. This is a Surefire 60-round magazine. It is a quad stack here at the bottom, double stack here, quad stack here, and results with these are questionable.
A little bit sketchy by most reports. Now, I don't think either of us have ever had, we haven't used them a lot, but we have used them a couple times in matches. We've never had an issue with them.
Now, I will say this, let me be fair. I did buy one before we ever met Mr. Sullivan. I did buy one retail. And the very first gen one I had some issues.
He did tell us that they had some issues that they had to rectify.
They tweaked them, and this was why he gave us this one, because it was one of the later generation models. This one has never caused a problem. So, interesting. Also interesting in terms of length. It is not much longer than a 30.
It's a quad stack down at the bottom.
So you can see his goals here was to meet that.
Right.
And I think he did.
Again, the problem with those is that you still have that fundamental problem from the very first AR mags where the body is aluminum to keep the weight down.
Yep.
And those aluminum feed lips can bend, and you may not know it.
That the insidious aluminum feed lip problem exists still on the Surefire 60.
Yeah.
Then we also went crazy, and they did 100. This has no practical application anywhere. Where would you use this? I mean, maybe in some sort of mounted gun that was behind a wall or something, prone with this is laughable.
Yeah.
I bring it here just to point it out. This one also has been reliable.
Yep.
But, whoa, okay, we're not meeting any length requirements here, right? So, and then last but not least, probably the newest contender to the market, the D60 drum.
And it's interesting how long Magpul took to get a product like this out.
Well, you have historically been kind of dubious on drum magazines in general.
Yeah, the way I see it, no military ever really adopts a second version of a drum. Everyone adopts a drum, and then they go, oh wait, that wasn't a great idea. And the next gun that they have, or the next version of the gun, they go to a stick.
Yep.
So the PPSH went to a stick mag. The Finnish Suomi went to stick mags. The Luger, obviously, they went back to stick mags.
That was a very early drum experiment there.
Yeah. The Russians had a drum magazine in 7.62 for the RPK, and when they went to the RPK 74, they ditched the drums and they went to 45-round stick mags. Who else is
But we're now seeing the Marines with their IAR project trying to experiment with the D60 drum because it is a sustained rate of fire problem that they're trying to address.
Right.
How many rounds can they fire before a reload is required?
Right.
And we have found with the Weapons Technology Project, the D60 has been extremely reliable.
Yeah.
We have had really no issues with this.
No, we've had issues in one situation, and that is when you are home after the match unloading your mags.
That's true.
Just don't unload this thing.
Not by hand. If you're unloading it by hand with like a tool, that is when I have induced a malfunction in this. But when you were using it to cycle in the gun.
Right, in the gun, shooting, never had any issues.
Plus, they're very slow to reload. You have to go through this process.
All drums are slow to
But there's that. Okay, so now that's that. And that's really the world of magazines that we're going to talk about for today. I think when we get into the weight discussion, this is when things start becoming even more interesting and revelationary. So if you take a USGI 20-round aluminum magazine, I'm sorry, I stacked them horribly here. That is 2.9 ounces or 82 grams.
All right.
All right. This is all in terms of increasing weight. The PMAG 20, which is the polymer equivalent of the USGI, goes up a little bit. We said they went up. They made such they used polymer, a modern material, but they went up in weight.
Right.
3.5 ounces, 98 grams, same capacity, but they wanted to have the rigidity and the durability and reliability. Thermold.
Yeah, thermolds and orlites.
Thermolds and orlites. So the thermold is 3.8 ounces, 108 grams.
Okay.
And that's a 30-round capacity magazine. Right. The orlite is 3.9 ounces, 111 grams. So you might notice we have not yet gotten to the USGI aluminum stamped aluminum 30-rounder.
Okay.
The Thermold Orlite
so
PMAG 20.
And 3.9.
Yep. And the USGI 30 comes in at 4 ounces, 115 grams.
So minusculely heavier, but these guys are actually lighter than the aluminum.
This is why I think when they went with the Thermold and Orlite, it wasn't a reliability concern, at least not yet. It was how do we make a 30-round magazine even lighter?
Probably both.
Maybe. However, they did not succeed on the reliability side of that. The Plinker, this garbage mag I mentioned, that's 4.2 ounces.
Cool.
119 grams. The Lancer, because it has the steel feed lips, 4.5 ounces, 127 grams. So 5 ounces heavier than the USGI, and
0.5 ounces heavier.
0.5, excuse me. Right. And then, of course, 115 grams versus 127. So there you go there. A little bit of weight there.
Yep.
Now we're at the PMAG, the 30-round Generation 3. 4.7 ounces, 135 grams.
Okay.
So
you've added almost 20% of
0.7 ounce. Yep, yeah, exactly. So you added mass, but you now have a far more reliable magazine.
Right.
It is that 0.7 ounces is worth, in my opinion, is a place where the weight gain is worth it because you have a magazine you can trust.
In fact, the weight's not, for our practical purposes, the weight's not a big issue with almost any of these.
Not the magazines, until you get to the HK high reliability mag.
Right.
Okay, we said the USGI is 4.0 ounces.
Yep.
The PMAG is 4.7. This
that.
30-round capacity, 9 ounces or 255 grams.
So more than double the weight of this, double the weight of a PMAG.
You could carry 2 polymer Gen 3 PMAGs for 1 HK high reliability mag.
Now, to be fair, that's unloaded.
Yeah,
But
it's still 30 rounds.
Yeah.
The weight of the ammunition is the same.
True.
So the point is, two of those for one of these unloaded. Fair enough.
Yeah.
But still, that's incredible.
Yeah.
That's a huge
Yeah, they add a
difference.
lot of weight with that.
So
that adds up. I mean, 4 of those mags, you have added an extra pound
and this becomes
to
even
your weight.
even more interesting in that, I mean, my experience using these, and I've used more than this one, the PMAG is more reliable than this.
Yeah.
So you've added double the weight, and it's not as reliable as the polymer equivalent.
Yep.
Then we get into the big bad boys, right?
Yeah.
So the 60.
So this is kind of cool.
This is interesting. This is Sullivan genius going on here.
Yeah.
A Surefire 60 is 8.0 ounces or 228 grams.
4 ounce? 8 ounce.
It is, this being a 60 round quad stack magazine is, through some magic of his, literally just double the weight of a 30.
That's pretty cool.
So if you had a loadout of Surefire 60s and you had the same amount of ammunition on you, you would be the same weight.
Yeah.
That's pretty fascinating, and you're avoiding a reload
Right.
every time. At least one reload, right? You're avoiding one reload every time.
Yep.
Now, this is where things get even more interesting.
That thing.
The drum, the D60.
These are heavy.
20 ounces.
Ooh.
564 grams. So at 20 ounces,
So-
if a USGI 30 is 4, you can carry 5.
Double the capacity, 5 times the weight.
Yep. So you are literally going to 5 times the weight
Yeah.
to avoid one reload.
Yeah.
Now, I think there are instances in which avoiding that one reload does necessitate and have value towards carrying that heavy of a magazine.
Yep.
The IAR, or the Squad Automatic Weapon Project, makes sense.
I totally agree.
Yep. And if you want to avoid a reload and have that as your first magazine and the rest being stick mags, also makes sense.
Now that's where I think this comes into play, especially with our stoner rifles. We actually, I might have one, I know you have, an actual belt pouch for a DMAG.
I do.
And I don't think you've ever actually used it.
It's completely unwieldy.
One of the just universal problems with drums is they're awkward to carry. I mean, these things, you can't have a pouch full of these. In fact, this is going to take up the space of a 3-round, if not 4-round pouch
Probably.
of stick mags. So I really like the concept of carrying this in the gun. In competition terms, start with this, but then all of your reloads are standard stick mags. The chances, the vast majority of times you're using the gun, you're not going to empty this drum.
No.
And if you do, I don't know that the small number of times that you do make it worth the hassle and the just pain in the butt of carrying spare drums on your body somehow.
I agree. I think you use the drum as your initial contact magazine, whether it's a match or real world, and then you switch to sticks.
Yeah.
This makes a lot of sense in the Squad Automatic Weapon Project.
Yeah.
Because you avoid one reload and you have a higher duration of sustained fire from at least the first magazine.
Right.
And we also, I'd like to reference one of the modcasts I was on with PNS in which Chuck Pressburg was talking about this, and he was mentioning reloads in magazines, and he said, you never go through more than your 30-round mag. He said, very rarely, I should say. He said, if you go past your first 30-round mag in a combat scenario, he goes, those guys are really there to fight. He goes, that's an interesting day. So that was him. I can't speak for that.
Now, the other interesting
But
thing
it's
is,
an interesting point.
I think that is a bit specialized to our current warfare in the Middle East, in Afghanistan and Iraq, where you're fighting sort of literally an insurgent sort of force.
Yes.
If this was 1985 and the Russians came through the Fulda Gap, you're going to have more open field, continuous warfare where guys will be using more magazines. But
It does make this and that an interesting question, though, in that this does not increase your weight loadout.
Right.
And it does give you the same capacity.
And it doesn't have the awkwardness to carry like this thing does.
You can put this in pouches.
Yeah.
You
You
can
do double pouches for those things without too much trouble.
Well, you can actually take a standard double USGI 30-round pouch and just put one of these in each. And every time you have one of these, instead of 2 USGI 30s, you're avoiding one reload.
Yeah.
So from a practical application, this makes more sense.
It'd be really cool if Magpul made one of those.
It would.
In fact, it is interesting to consider why they didn't. Because Magpul clearly wanted to make a 60-round minimum length high
Weren't
cap
they
mag.
experimenting with that for a long time?
I'm sure they did.
Yep.
The other, just as nobody has ever really gone back to drum mags historically, nobody's really pulled off quad stacks.
No, the Russians tried it. They actually downed it to 50 rounds instead of 60 because they had reliability issues.
Boy, the difference between a 50-round quad stack and a 45-round double stack, I don't know that I'd bother with the quad stack in that.
I have quite a bit of experience with the Suomi coffin mags
Yep.
that I ran in my submachine gun. Now, some of you out there have had better experiences than I. I found those to be utterly unreliable.
Yeah.
I could never get them to work, and in fact, this is an instance in which the drums were far preferable
Right.
to those coffin mags.
And you'll notice after World War II, the Finns went to 36-round traditional double stack stick mags.
sure did.
And got rid of the coffin mags entirely.
So in that regard, in regards to the What Would Stoner Do project, the answer became very simple to us. It was always PMAG. We knew that from the beginning. Turns out the D60 was actually the right choice for the first magazine.
Yep.
As long as it's in a division that you can use it in or for real-world application,
Yeah.
then you switch to stick mags.
Yeah.
And I'm serious, don't bother with anything else. It doesn't matter if there's anyone else on the market that does something somehow better. There's nothing that you need to do that's better than what is a reliable magazine that already has worked and been proven for years.
There are two options if you want an alternative to PMags. There are either the ones that are cheaper than PMags or the ones that are allegedly higher quality than PMags. And if you go higher quality, you're going to pay many times the price You're looking at Lancers are like $30 mags, aren't they?
I don't know, but it doesn't matter. What's more high?
Right.
What is higher quality than a mag that you can look at and determine if it's working or not,
Right.
and then drop it on the ground, pick it up, and use it again for essentially a decade?
Right. The thing is, if you go to allegedly higher quality, you're not actually getting any better reliability, and you're paying substantially more money.
Yep.
If you go to someone who's trying to undercut Magpul, this is the economy of scale. Magpul is able to make those things dirt cheap because they came up with a design that works. Everybody loves it, and so they manufacture them by the gazillions.
Yes.
If you have a startup company that's trying to make a competitor to PMags, the only way to undercut them is to substantially reduce your quality. The stuff,
a good point.
if it's $7 instead of $9, you're saving basically nothing, and you're getting a substantially inferior product.
This has become the instance in which the standard, which a PMag I think is arguably a standard now, is a standard because it is the superior product.
It is, in fact, the exact same situation you would have had with aluminum magazines 20 years ago.
Yeah.
You can spend $10 and get a GI top-of-the-line aluminum mag, or you could spend $8 and get one of those horrific non-marked knockoffs.
You can get one of those things I threw away back there.
The ones that have the little round stamping, like the lineup hole for when they do the stamping.
About those.
They have no markings on them. And they had like 40 rounders too.
Yeah.
And they all were just, they sucked.
It's like, did you ever see one of them work ever? No. Yeah.
So you take first it was GI, and now we've improved it with PMags.
Yeah.
The best thing on the market. They're produced in such an economy of scale that no one can compete with them on price and quality at the same time.
And we didn't even touch on other things like, for example, the feed geometry is appropriate for M855A1. So the Marines, of all people, are actually starting to look at these because of that in terms of the IAR project, but also the cartridge.
Yep.
So there's other things going on here that make sense as well. Anti-tilt follower, reliability, blah, blah, blah. Cheap, economy of scale. The answer is, what would Stoner do? And I think this is what Stoner would have done. This is our version of what Stoner. This is what Stoner would have done. D60s, PMag 30s.
Yep.
Straight up. That's it. I have nothing more to say to that. I think that's conclusive. So, guys, if you like this kind of stuff, please consider supporting us on Patreon. It is truly only Patreon that keeps InRange alive. We do not have any ad revenue from AdSense or anything like that. We are completely Patreon. You guys.
And I do want to throw out full disclosure. We did not receive any of these magazines for free, with the exception of Jim Sullivan gave us some of the Surefire stick mags.
Yes.
The D mags we bought ourselves.
Yes.
We actually had a really cool viewer give us a couple extra.
That's true, but that was after we'd already used them.
Yeah,
yes,
but
correct.
the first ones we paid.
Aaron, viewer Aaron, thank you, Aaron, for your support and for sending us some D-mags.
But the first ones we bought retail at a gun show.
Yep.
Because we're like, Magpul's never even going to bother sending us any for free.
No.
Why would they? Never. Yeah.
They shouldn't.
They don't care. So, but we were not paid by them or anyone else.
So every magazine here, except for the ones from Jim Sullivan himself, were bought by our own money or InRange funds.
I just like having that disclaimer in.
No, that makes sense.
We'll be straight up front with you guys about what we got for free, what we got at a discount, what we paid for ourselves.
I even bought this ridiculous HK mag, so it would go with our HK 416 project. So, anyways, that's where it's at. So, guys, thanks for keeping us alive. Stay tuned for more, and please share and subscribe.